While on patrol, Officer Greg stumbles upon a starving black boy in a dumpster. What he does next shocks the entire town, defying everything they thought they knew about him. But, as Greg delves deeper into the boy's mysterious past, he uncovers dark secrets that could threaten both of their lives. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today, and if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. The night air was cool and crisp as Officer Greg walked his usual beat. The streets were quiet, save for the distant hum of traffic and the occasional bark of a dog. Greg's footsteps echoed on the empty sidewalk, his eyes scanning the familiar storefronts and alleyways. Suddenly, a faint sound caught his attention. Greg paused, his hand instinctively moving to his belt. He listened intently, trying to pinpoint the source of the noise. There it was again, a soft whimper coming from the alley behind an old boarded-up building. Greg's heart quickened as he approached the dark passageway. "Hello?" he called out, his voice steady despite the unease growing in his chest. "Is anyone there?" No answer came, but as Greg stepped deeper into the alley, he heard it again, a muffled cry that sent a chill down his spine. He followed the sound, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness until it fell upon a large, rusty dumpster. With a deep breath, Greg lifted the heavy lid. What he saw inside made his stomach lurch. A small boy, no more than 6 years old, lay curled up among the trash. The child's dark skin was smudged with dirt, and his thin frame shook with each sob. "Oh my God," Greg whispered, his usual stoic demeanor crumbling at the sight. "Hey there, little guy. It's okay. I'm here to help." The boy's tear-filled eyes met Greg's, filled with fear and exhaustion. Greg reached into the dumpster, his hands gentle as he lifted the child out. "What's your name, son?" "Jordan," the boy stuttered, his voice barely audible. Greg cradled Jordan close, feeling the child's small body trembling against him. "It's all right, Jordan. You're safe now. I'm going to take you to get some help, okay?" As Greg carried Jordan to his patrol car, he felt something stir deep within him. A protective instinct he thought had long since disappeared. The boy's fragile form in his arms awakened emotions Greg had buried years ago. At the hospital, Greg paced the waiting room, unable to shake the image of Jordan's frightened face from his mind. He'd seen a lot in his years on the force, but this was different. For the first time in a long time, Greg felt truly shaken. A nurse approached, her kind eyes meeting Greg's worried gaze. "Officer, the boy is asking for you." Greg nodded, swallowing hard as he followed her to Jordan's room. The sight of the small figure in the hospital bed, dwarfed by white sheets and beeping machines, made Greg's heart ache in a way he hadn't experienced in years. "Hey there, Jordan," Greg said softly, pulling up a chair beside the bed. "How are you feeling?" Jordan's dark eyes, still wide with fear, locked onto Greg's face. Are you going to stay?" the boy whispered. Greg felt a lump form in his throat. Without hesitation, he reached out and gently took Jordan's small hand in his own. "I'm not going anywhere, buddy. I promise." As Jordan's grip tightened around his fingers, Greg felt something shift inside him. The walls he'd built around his heart began to crumble, and for the first time in a long time, Officer Greg allowed himself to feel. As the doctors finished their examination of Jordan, Greg stood outside the hospital room, his face a mask of concern. The lead physician approached him, clipboard in hand, her expression grave. "Officer," she began, her voice low, "I'm afraid Jordan's condition is quite serious. He's severely malnourished and shows signs of long-term neglect." Greg's jaw tightened, his hands clenching at his sides. "How bad is it, Doc?" The doctor sighed, flipping through her notes. "We're treating him for dehydration and malnutrition. There are also some older injuries that have healed poorly. It's clear this child hasn't received proper care for quite some time." Greg nodded, his throat tight. "What happens now?" "We'll keep him here for observation and treatment. Social services have been notified. They'll be here soon to discuss placement options." As if on cue, a small voice called out from the room. "Officer Greg? Where are you?" Greg's heart clenched at the sound of Jordan's frightened voice. He turned to the doctor. "May I?" She nodded, and Greg entered the room again. Jordan's eyes lit up when he saw him, his small hands reaching out. A social worker arrived shortly after, her kind face creased with concern as she took in the scene. "Hello, Jordan. I'm Ms. Willow. I'm here to help find you a safe place to stay." Jordan's grip on Greg's hand tightened, his eyes wide with fear. "No, I want to stay with Officer Greg." Greg felt a lump form in his throat. He looked at Jordan, then at Miss Willow, unsure of what to say. The social worker smiled gently. "I know this is scary, Jordan, but we need to make sure you're somewhere safe while we figure things out." Jordan's eyes filled with tears. "But I feel safe with Greg. Please don't make me go." As Jordan clung to him, Greg felt something stir deep within his chest. Memories of his own childhood flashed through his mind. The fear, the loneliness, the constant uncertainty. He remembered what it felt like to be shuffled from one foster home to another, never feeling truly safe or wanted. Greg swallowed hard, surprised by the intensity of his emotions. He'd spent years building walls around his heart, keeping everyone at arm's length. But now, looking at Jordan's frightened face, those walls were crumbling. "It's okay, Jordan," Greg found himself saying, his voice hoarse with emotion. "I'm not going anywhere. We'll figure this out together, okay?" Jordan nodded, his grip on Greg's hand loosening slightly as he relaxed. Ms. Willow watched the interaction with interest. "Officer Greg, may I speak with you outside for a moment?" Greg nodded, gently disentangling his hand from Jordan's. "I'll be right back, buddy, I promise." As he stepped into the hallway with the social worker, Greg felt a strange mix of emotions swirling inside him. He didn't fully understand why he felt so drawn to this child, why Jordan's plight affected him so deeply. But he knew one thing for certain. He couldn't walk away from this. Not now. Not when Jordan needed him most. The next morning, Greg arrived at the hospital early, his mind heavy with thoughts of Jordan. He'd barely slept, tossing and turning as he wrestled with unfamiliar emotions. As he approached Jordan's room, he saw Ms. Willow waiting outside again. "Good morning, Officer Greg," she greeted him, her smile warm but her eyes tired. "I'm glad you're here. We need to discuss Jordan's situation." Greg nodded, his stomach tightening. "How is he?" "He's doing better physically, but he's very anxious," Ms. Willow explained. "I'm afraid I have some concerning news." They stepped into an empty consultation room and Ms. Willow closed the door behind them. She took a deep breath before continuing. "We've been trying to locate Jordan's mother, but she seems to have disappeared. There's no information on any other family members." Greg felt his heart sink. "What does that mean for Jordan?" Ms. Willow's expression turned grave. "Without any family to take him in, we'll need to place Jordan in temporary foster care until we can find a more permanent solution." The words hit Greg like a punch to the gut. Images of his own experiences in foster care flashed through his mind. The uncertainty, the fear, the loneliness. He couldn't bear the thought of Jordan going through the same thing. "Isn't there another option?" Greg asked, his voice strained. Ms. Willow shook her head sadly. "I'm afraid not. We don't have any other immediate alternatives." Greg stood there, his mind racing. He thought of Jordan's frightened eyes, the way the boy had clung to him. Before he could stop himself, words tumbled out of his mouth. What if I took him in, just for a few days until you can find something better?" Ms. Willow's eyes widened in surprise. "Officer Greg, that's unexpected. Are you sure about this?" Greg was as shocked by his offer as she was. He'd always kept people at arm's length, never letting anyone get too close. But something about Jordan had broken through his carefully constructed walls. I think so," Greg said, his voice growing stronger. "I have a spare room. I can take some time off work. It would just be temporary, until you find a better solution." Ms. Willow studied him carefully. "This is highly unusual, Officer Greg. We'd need to do a quick background check and home inspection, and there would be a lot of paperwork." Greg nodded, feeling a mix of nervousness and determination. "I understand. I'm willing to do whatever it takes." After a moment of consideration, Ms. Willow smiled. Well, if you're sure, I think this could be a good solution for Jordan, at least in the short term. He seems to trust you, and that's not something we see often in cases like this. They spent the next hour discussing the details and filling out preliminary paperwork. Greg's head was spinning, but he felt a strange sense of peace. He knew this wouldn't be easy, but he also knew it was the right thing to do. As they finished up, Ms. Willow looked at Greg with a mixture of admiration and curiosity. I have to say, Officer Greg, I'm impressed. It's not often we see someone step up like this, especially someone with no prior connection to the child. Greg shrugged, feeling a bit uncomfortable under her gaze. I couldn't bear the thought of him being alone and scared. No kid should have to go through that. The next morning, Greg pulled into his driveway, glancing in the rearview mirror at Jordan, who sat quietly in the back seat. The boy's wide eyes took in the unfamiliar surroundings, his small hands clutching the straps of his backpack. Well, here we are, Greg said, trying to sound cheerful. He got out and opened Jordan's door. This is where I live. It'll be your home for a little while, too. Jordan nodded silently, following Greg to the front door. As they stepped inside, Greg realized how stark and uninviting his house must seem to a child. The walls were bare, the furniture practical and plain. There were no colorful toys or family photos, nothing to suggest that a kid had ever set foot in this space before. Let me show you to your room, Greg said, leading Jordan down the hallway. He opened the door to the spare bedroom, which now felt woefully inadequate. I know it's not much, but we can make it more comfortable for you. Jordan placed his backpack on the bed and looked around, his expression unreadable. Greg felt a pang of uncertainty. What was he supposed to do now? Are you hungry? He asked, grasping for something familiar. I can make us some dinner. Jordan nodded again, and they made their way to the kitchen. Greg opened his refrigerator, suddenly aware of how ill-prepared he was for feeding a child. He managed to put together a simple meal of sandwiches and apple slices, which they ate in awkward silence. As the evening wore on, Greg felt increasingly out of his depth. His usual routine of watching the news and reviewing case files seemed impossible with Jordan's quiet presence. Instead, he found himself trying to engage the boy, asking gentle questions that were met with one-word answers or shy nods. When bedtime came, Greg helped Jordan get settled in his new room. If you need anything during the night, I'll be right down the hall, he said, hesitating at the doorway. Good night, Jordan. Night, Jordan whispered, his first word since they'd left the hospital. After making sure Jordan was asleep, Greg sat at his kitchen table, his head in his hands. The silence of the house, once comforting, now felt oppressive. He thought about his orderly life, his carefully maintained routines, and how quickly they'd been upended. What was I thinking? He muttered to himself. He had no idea how to care for a child, let alone one who had been through so much trauma. The weight of responsibility settled heavily on his shoulders. Yet, as he considered calling Ms. Willow to tell her he'd made a mistake, he remembered the look in Jordan's eyes when he'd offered to take him in. That flicker of hope, of trust, was something Greg couldn't bring himself to extinguish. The next morning, Greg stood in front of his bathroom mirror, adjusting his police uniform. He glanced at his reflection, noting the dark circles under his eyes from a restless night. The sound of small footsteps in the hallway reminded him of his new reality. "Jordan?" he called out. "Are you ready for school?" A quiet yes came from the other side of the door. Greg took a deep breath, steeling himself for the day ahead. He knew taking Jordan to school would mean facing the public eye, something he usually avoided. As they pulled into the school parking lot, Greg felt a knot forming in his stomach. Parents and children milled about, their chatter dying down as Greg's police cruiser came to a stop. He could feel curious eyes on them as he helped Jordan out of the car. "Have a good day," Greg said awkwardly, patting Jordan's shoulder. The boy nodded and walked towards the school entrance, his small backpack bouncing with each step. Greg turned to leave but found himself face to face with a group of parents. Their expressions ranged from surprise to barely concealed curiosity. "Officer Greg," one mother said, her voice tinged with gossip. "We heard you're fostering that poor boy. How unexpected." Greg shifted uncomfortably. "Just doing my duty," he mumbled, making his way back to his car. As he drove to the police station, Greg couldn't shake the feeling of being under a microscope. The town had always seen him as the strict, no-nonsense cop. Now he was sure his name was on everyone's lips. Entering the station, Greg was met with a chorus of whispers and pointed looks. His fellow officers, usually focused on their work, now seemed more interested in him than their daily tasks. "Hey, Greg," Officer Martinez called out. "Heard you've gone soft on us. Taking in strays now, are we?" Greg felt his jaw clench. The boy needed help, he said curtly, heading to his desk. Captain Johnson stepped out of his office, eyeing Greg with a mix of concern and curiosity. "Greg, can I see you for a moment?" Inside the captain's office, Greg braced himself for questions. "I have to say, Greg," Captain Johnson began, leaning back in his chair, "this isn't like you. Taking in a child? Are you sure you know what you're getting into?" Greg struggled to find the right words. "Sir, I couldn't just leave him. He had nowhere else to go." The captain's eyebrows raised. "I never pegged you for the nurturing type. You've always been so focused on the job." "I'm still focused," Greg assured him, feeling defensive. "This won't affect my work." As he left the office, Greg could feel the weight of his colleagues' stares. The station buzzed with hushed conversations, and he knew he was the main topic. For a man who had always valued his privacy and professional distance, this newfound attention was deeply unsettling. As the days passed, Greg found himself navigating unfamiliar territory. His once orderly home now had scattered toys and children's books strewn about. He'd bought them for Jordan, hoping to make the boy feel more at ease, but Jordan remained withdrawn, barely touching the new items. One evening, Greg stood in the kitchen, staring at the open refrigerator. Cooking for two was a new challenge. He pulled out some eggs and milk, deciding pancakes might be a safe bet. "Jordan?" he called out. "Do you like pancakes?" A small voice replied from the living room. "Yes." Greg nodded to himself, relieved. As he mixed the batter, he glanced over at Jordan, who sat quietly on the couch, hugging a stuffed bear Greg had bought him. "You know," Greg said, trying to sound casual, "when I was your age, I loved pancakes, especially with lots of syrup." Jordan looked up, a flicker of interest in his eyes. "Really?" Greg felt a small surge of hope. "Yeah, really. Want to help me make them?" Jordan hesitated, then slowly nodded. He padded over to the kitchen, and Greg lifted him onto a chair so he could reach the counter. "Here," Greg said, handing Jordan a wooden spoon. "Want to stir?" As they cooked together, Greg felt some of the tension in the air start to dissipate. Jordan even smiled a little when Greg accidentally flipped a pancake too high and it stuck to the ceiling. That night, Greg tucked Jordan into bed feeling a bit more confident. Maybe he could do this after all. But in the early hours of the morning, a heart-wrenching cry jolted Greg awake. Without thinking, he leaped out of bed and rushed to Jordan's room. The boy was sitting up in bed, tears streaming down his face, his body shaking with sobs. "Mommy!" he cried. "I want my mommy!" Greg froze for a moment, unsure what to do. But then, something inside him took over. He sat on the edge of the bed and gently pulled Jordan into his arms. "Shh, it's okay," he murmured, rubbing Jordan's back. "You're safe. It was just a bad dream." Jordan clung to Greg, his small hands gripping Greg's t-shirt tightly. Greg held him close, rocking slightly, murmuring soothing words until Jordan's sobs subsided into quiet hiccups. As Jordan's breathing evened out, Greg felt a warmth spread through his chest. He looked down at the boy in his arms, feeling a fierce protectiveness he'd never experienced before. Next day, Greg sat at his desk in the police station, his brow furrowed as he pored over the case files. The more he dug into Jordan's background, the more troubled he became. Each new piece of information painted a darker picture. "Hey, Thompson," he called to a fellow officer. "Can you pull up any records on a woman named Leah Carter?" As Greg waited, he thought about Jordan, now safely at school. The boy had started to open up a little, but there was still so much fear in his eyes. Officer Thompson's voice snapped Greg back to reality. Got something, Greg. Leah Carter, age 32. Multiple hospital visits over the past few years. Looks like domestic violence, but charges were always dropped. Greg's stomach twisted. He'd seen cases like this before, but now it felt personal. Any current address? Thompson shook his head. Nothing recent. Looks like she vanished about 6 months ago. Greg leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. 6 months. That's probably when Leah had decided to run. As he delved deeper, a disturbing pattern emerged. Leah's ex-partner, Jordan's father, had ties to a local criminal gang. The man had a history of violence and was still at large. Greg's heart raced as the full picture came into focus. Jordan and Leah weren't just running from an abusive relationship. They were hiding from a dangerous criminal. He stared at the photo of Leah on his computer screen. Her eyes held the same haunted look he'd seen in Jordan's. Greg felt a surge of protectiveness wash over him. I need to keep them safe, he muttered to himself. Just then his phone rang. It was Jordan's school. The boy had a meltdown during class and was asking for Greg. Without hesitation, Greg grabbed his jacket and keys. As he rushed out of the station, he knew his life had changed forever. He wasn't just a temporary caregiver anymore. He was Jordan's protector, and he wouldn't let anyone harm this boy or his mother. Greg arrived home late that evening, his mind still reeling from the day's events. Jordan was tucked safely in bed, finally asleep after a long, emotional day. The boy's breakdown at school had shaken Greg more than he cared to admit. As he stepped onto his front porch, Greg noticed something out of place. A plain white envelope lay on the welcome mat, no stamps or return address in sight. His police instincts kicked in, and he carefully picked it up, examining it closely. With a growing sense of unease, Greg entered his home and locked the door behind him. He glanced towards Jordan's room, making sure the boy was still asleep, before sitting down at the kitchen table to open the mysterious letter. His hands trembled slightly as he unfolded the paper inside. The message was short, typed in bold letters. Stay away from the boy. This is your only warning. Greg's heart pounded in his chest as he read and reread the words. The threat was clear, and it confirmed his worst fears. Jordan's father knew where they were. For a moment, Greg felt a wave of panic wash over him. He thought about calling for backup, about sending Jordan away to a safe house. But then, he heard a small whimper from the boy's room, and something inside him shifted. Greg's jaw clenched as he looked at the letter again. Instead of fear, he now felt a surge of determination. This wasn't just about doing his job anymore. It was about protecting an innocent child who had already been through so much. He stood up, walking quietly to Jordan's room. The boy was curled up in bed, clutching the stuffed bear Greg had bought him. In the dim light, Greg could see the tear stains on Jordan's cheeks. I won't let anyone hurt you, Greg whispered, his voice barely audible. I promise. As he watched Jordan sleep, Greg's resolve strengthened. He knew they were in serious danger now, but he also knew he would do whatever it took to keep Jordan safe. The road ahead would be difficult, but Greg was ready to face it head on. The next morning, Greg arrived at the police station earlier than usual. He clutched the threatening letter in his hand, his face set with determination. As his fellow officers trickled in, he called them together for an impromptu meeting. I need your help, Greg said, his voice steady despite the worry in his eyes. He placed the letter on the table for everyone to see. Officer Martinez leaned in, frowning as she read the message. This is serious, Greg. Have you reported it? Greg nodded. I have, but without more evidence, there's not much that can be done officially. Captain Johnson sighed, rubbing his forehead. He's right. We can't act on an anonymous threat alone. We need more to go on. Greg felt frustration bubbling up inside him. He understood the rules, but this was different. This was about Jordan. I can't just sit back and do nothing, Greg said, his voice rising slightly. Jordan's safety is at stake here. The room fell silent for a moment. Greg's colleagues exchanged glances, unused to seeing such emotion from their usually stoic co-worker. What do you want to do? Officer Chen asked softly. Greg took a deep breath. I'm going to dig deeper into Leah's history. There has to be a connection we're missing between her, her ex, and this gang. Captain Johnson nodded slowly. All right, Greg, but be careful. Don't do anything that could jeopardize your position or Jordan's safety. As Greg left the station, he felt a mix of determination and unease. He knew he was treading a fine line, but he couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. Back at home, Greg found Jordan sitting at the kitchen table, pushing his cereal around in the bowl. The boy looked up as Greg entered, his eyes wide and questioning. "Everything okay?" Jordan asked quietly. Greg managed a small smile. "Yeah, buddy. Everything's fine. How about we do something fun today?" Jordan's face lit up, a rare smile spreading across his features. "Can we go to the park?" Greg nodded, his heart warming at the sight of Jordan's excitement. As they walked to the nearby playground, Jordan's small hand slipped into Greg's. The simple gesture nearly brought tears to Greg's eyes. At the park, Jordan slowly began to open up. He talked about his favorite games and books, things he missed about his mom, and even some of his fears. "Do you think my mom is okay?" Jordan asked suddenly, his voice trembling. Greg knelt down, looking Jordan in the eyes. "I'm doing everything I can to find her, Jordan. I promise." Jordan nodded, then surprised Greg by wrapping his arms around him in a tight hug. "I'm glad you found me," he whispered. As Greg held the boy close, he felt his resolve strengthen even further. He would protect Jordan and find Leah, no matter what it took. Greg's investigation led him to a small, run-down apartment complex on the outskirts of town. This was Leah's last known address, and Greg felt a mix of hope and anxiety as he approached the building. The paint was peeling and the stairs creaked under his feet as he climbed to the second floor. He knocked on the door of apartment 2B, his heart pounding. After a moment, an elderly woman with kind eyes opened the door. "Can I help you?" she asked, eyeing Greg's uniform warily. Greg introduced himself and explained why he was there. The woman's face softened as he mentioned Leah's name. "Oh, that poor dear," she sighed. "I'm Mrs. Smith. I lived next door to Leah for a few months. Come in, officer. I'll tell you what I know." Greg stepped inside the small, cluttered apartment. Mrs. Smith offered him a seat at her kitchen table and poured him a cup of tea. "Leah was always so quiet, always looking over her shoulder," Mrs. Smith began. "She told me bits and pieces over time. That man she was running from, he was a real monster." Greg leaned forward, hanging on every word. "Did she ever mention where she might go next?" Mrs. Smith shook her head sadly. "No, she was too scared to tell anyone her plans. But I do know she'd been trying to escape him for months. Every time she thought she was safe, he'd somehow find her." Greg's heart sank. He could only imagine the terror Leah must have lived with every day. "The last time I saw her," Mrs. Smith continued, her voice quivering, "she was in such a state. Said she had to leave her boy behind to keep him safe. It broke her heart, but she was sure that man was close to finding them again." Greg felt a lump form in his throat. He thought of Jordan, so small and vulnerable, left alone because his mother believed it was the only way to protect him. "Thank you, Mrs. Smith," Greg said, standing up. "You've been very helpful." As he turned to leave, Mrs. Smith caught his arm. "Officer, please find her. That woman deserves some peace." Greg nodded solemnly. "I'll do everything I can." As he walked back to his car, Greg's determination grew stronger than ever. He had to find Leah, not just for Jordan's sake, but for hers as well. But he knew the clock was ticking. If Leah's ex was as dangerous as everyone said, both she and Jordan were in grave danger. As the days passed, Jordan slowly began to open up to Greg. One evening, as they sat at the kitchen table eating dinner, Jordan suddenly spoke up. "Mom used to make spaghetti like this," he said quietly, twirling the pasta on his fork. Greg paused, surprised by the unexpected comment. "Did she?" he asked gently, encouraging Jordan to continue. Jordan nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Yeah, but she'd always put extra cheese on top. She said it was our special treat." Greg felt a warmth spread through his chest as he watched Jordan's eyes light up with the memory. "That sounds nice, buddy. Would you like to tell me more about your mom?" Jordan hesitated for a moment, then began to speak. His words came out in a rush, as if he'd been holding them in for too long. "We moved a lot," he said. "Mom always said we were on an adventure, but I knew she was scared. She'd pack our stuff real fast sometimes, and we'd leave in the middle of the night." Greg's heart ached as he listened. He could picture Leah frantically gathering their belongings, trying to stay one step ahead of danger. "But she always made sure I was okay," Jordan continued, his voice growing softer. "Even when we didn't have much, she'd find ways to make me happy. Like one time we couldn't afford new toys, so she made me a superhero cape out of an old blanket." Tears welled up in Greg's eyes as he imagined Leah's love and dedication to her son, even in the face of such hardship. "She sounds like a wonderful mom," Greg said, his voice thick with emotion. Jordan nodded, his own eyes glistening. "She is. I miss her so much." In that moment, Greg felt a surge of protectiveness wash over him. He reached out and gently squeezed Jordan's hand. "We're going to find her, Jordan. I promise." As Jordan shared more stories about his life with Leah, Greg realized just how deep the boy's trauma ran. The constant moving, the fear, the uncertainty. It had all left its mark on Jordan's young heart. But through it all, Leah's love had been a constant, a beacon of hope in their tumultuous life. Greg's determination to find Leah grew stronger with each story Jordan told. He knew that reuniting this brave little boy with his equally brave mother was more than just a job now. It was a mission that had become deeply personal. As the days passed, Officer Greg threw himself into the investigation with renewed vigor. He spent his evenings poring over case files and following up on leads, determined to uncover the truth about Jordan's father and find Leah. One breakthrough came when Greg discovered a pattern in the gang's activities. He noticed that they often used abandoned warehouses as temporary bases. This information led him to focus his search on industrial areas on the outskirts of town. Greg's dedication didn't go unnoticed by his colleagues. Officer Sarah, a fellow detective, approached him one morning at the station. "Greg, you're working yourself to the bone," she said, concern evident in her voice. "Is everything okay?" Greg sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I have to find Jordan's mom, Sarah. That boy has been through so much." Sarah nodded understandingly. "I get it. Just don't forget to take care of yourself too, okay?" Her words struck a chord with Greg. He realized that in his determination to help Jordan, he'd been neglecting his own well-being. But he couldn't stop now, not when he felt so close to finding answers. As Greg continued his investigation, he uncovered more about Jordan's father's criminal activities. The man was involved in drug trafficking and money laundering, with connections to some of the most dangerous criminals in the state. The more Greg learned, the more he understood why Leah had been so desperate to keep Jordan safe. One evening, as Greg was reviewing security camera footage from a gas station near one of the suspected warehouse locations, he spotted something that made his heart race. A woman who looked strikingly like Leah based on the photo Jordan had shown him was seen filling up a car late at night. Greg leaned closer to the screen, his eyes wide with excitement. The timestamp on the footage was from just 3 days ago. This was the most recent lead he'd found yet. With trembling hands, Greg picked up his phone to call his captain. As he dialed the number, he felt a mix of hope and anxiety. He was getting closer to finding Leah, but he knew that time was running out. Jordan's father and his gang were still out there, and they could be closing in too. Greg's investigation took a sudden, dangerous turn one evening as he was leaving the police station. He had just finished his shift and was heading to his car when he noticed 2 burly men leaning against it. Their tattoos and rough appearance immediately set off alarm bells in Greg's mind. As he approached, one of the men straightened up and fixed Greg with a cold stare. "Officer Greg, right?" he asked, his voice low and menacing. Greg's hand instinctively moved towards his holster. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" he asked, keeping his voice steady. The second man stepped forward, a cruel smile playing on his lips. "We hear you've been asking a lot of questions about certain business matters. Our associates aren't too happy about that." Greg's jaw clenched. He knew exactly who these men were associated with. Jordan's father and his gang. "I'm just doing my job," he replied firmly. The first man chuckled darkly. "Well, here's some friendly advice. Stop doing your job so thoroughly. It might not be good for your health, or the health of that little boy you've taken in." At the mention of Jordan, Greg felt a surge of protective anger. "Is that a threat?" he growled. "Let's call it a warning," the second man said, pushing off the car. "Stop asking questions, Officer Greg, for your own good." With that, the two men sauntered away, leaving Greg standing there, his heart pounding. He watched them disappear around the corner before quickly getting into his car and locking the doors. As he drove home, Greg's mind raced. The veiled threats echoed in his ears, and he knew he couldn't brush them off. These men were serious, and they had made it clear that both he and Jordan were in danger. Pulling into his driveway, Greg saw Jordan playing in the front yard with the neighbor's daughter. The sight of the boy laughing and carefree made Greg's resolve strengthen. He wouldn't let anything happen to Jordan. That night, after Jordan was asleep, Greg went through his house, checking and double-checking all the locks. He installed additional security measures, including a new alarm system and extra locks on the windows. He knew it might seem paranoid, but he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Over the next few days, Greg kept a closer eye on Jordan. He drove the boy to and from school himself, watching carefully for any signs of danger. At home, he made sure Jordan stayed inside or in the backyard, away from prying eyes. Despite his best efforts to hide his worry, Jordan noticed the change in Greg's behavior. One evening, as they sat at the dinner table, Jordan looked up at Greg with concerned eyes. "Are you okay, Officer Greg?" he asked softly. "You seem scared." Greg's heart melted at the boy's perceptiveness. He reached out and gently squeezed Jordan's hand. "I'm just being extra careful, buddy. But don't you worry. I'm going to keep you safe, no matter what." Next day, Greg sat at his desk late into the night, his phone pressed to his ear. The soft glow of his computer screen illuminated his tired face as he scribbled notes on a worn notepad. He was reaching out to old contacts, fellow officers he'd worked with years ago, hoping to gather more information on the gang and Jordan's father. "Thanks, Mike, I owe you one," Greg said, hanging up the phone. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his eyes. The information he'd gathered over the past few hours made his stomach churn. Jordan's father wasn't just some small-time criminal. He was a high-level member of a dangerous organization involved in trafficking and other illegal activities. The more Greg learned, the more he realized just how much danger Jordan and Leah were in. He glanced at the clock. It was well past midnight. Down the hall, he could hear Jordan's soft snores. The sound made Greg's heart ache. This little boy, who had already been through so much, was now at the center of something far more dangerous than Greg had initially thought. Greg turned back to his notes, his brow furrowed in concentration. He needed to find Leah, and fast. The urgency of the situation weighed heavily on him. Every minute that passed was another minute that Leah could be in danger. Another minute that Jordan's father could be closing in on them. He picked up his phone again, dialing another number. "Hey, Mina," he said when the call connected. "I know it's late, but I need a favor. It's about that case I mentioned." As Greg continued to dig deeper, the pieces of the puzzle started to come together. The organization Jordan's father was involved with had tentacles reaching far and wide. It wasn't just about drugs or weapons. They were involved in human trafficking, too. The thought made Greg's blood run cold. He couldn't help but wonder if Leah had discovered something about her ex-partner's activities. Was that why she had run? Was that why they were so desperate to find her? Greg's fingers flew over his keyboard as he cross-referenced the information he'd gathered. He was close, he could feel it. Somewhere in this web of criminal activity and danger, there had to be a clue to Leah's whereabouts. As the first rays of sunlight began to peek through his window, Greg sat back, his eyes burning from lack of sleep. He had a clearer picture now of what they were up against, but it didn't bring him any comfort. If anything, it made him more worried. He stood up, stretching his stiff muscles, and walked to Jordan's room. Peeking in, he saw the boy sleeping peacefully, unaware of the storm brewing around him. Greg's resolve strengthened. He would find Leah and keep Jordan safe, no matter what it took. The next morning, Greg shuffled into the kitchen, his eyes heavy from lack of sleep. He found Jordan already at the table, quietly munching on a bowl of cereal. Greg's heart warmed at the sight. Despite the danger lurking around them, this moment felt almost normal. "Morning, buddy," Greg said, ruffling Jordan's hair as he passed. "Sleep okay?" Jordan nodded, a small smile playing on his lips. "Yeah, no bad dreams last night." Greg poured himself a cup of coffee and sat across from Jordan. They ate in comfortable silence for a while, the only sound the clink of spoons against bowls and the occasional sip of coffee. As Greg finished his breakfast, he noticed Jordan fidgeting with his spoon, looking like he wanted to say something. "What's on your mind, Jordan?" Greg asked gently. Jordan looked up, his big brown eyes full of uncertainty. "Greg, do you think we'll find my mom soon?" Greg's heart clenched. He wanted to promise Jordan that they would, but he couldn't bring himself to make a promise he wasn't sure he could keep. Instead, he reached across the table and squeezed Jordan's hand. "I'm doing everything I can, buddy. We won't give up until we find her." Jordan nodded, his eyes welling up with tears. Without thinking, Greg stood up and moved to Jordan's side, pulling the boy into a hug. Jordan clung to him, his small body shaking with quiet sobs. "It's okay, Jordan. Let it out," Greg murmured, rubbing circles on the boy's back. He felt a lump forming in his own throat as he held Jordan. After a few minutes, Jordan's sobs subsided. He pulled back slightly, wiping his nose on his sleeve. Greg handed him a tissue, and Jordan blew his nose loudly. "Thanks," Jordan sniffled. Then, looking up at Greg with red-rimmed eyes, he said something that made Greg's heart stop. "You're really nice, Dad." Greg froze, unsure how to respond. Jordan seemed to realize what he'd said, and his eyes widened in panic. I'm sorry," Jordan stammered. "I didn't mean to." Greg quickly shook his head, finding his voice. "It's okay, Jordan. You don't have to be sorry." He knelt down so he was eye level with the boy. "I know I'm not your real dad, but I care about you a lot, and if you want to call me that, it's okay with me." Jordan's face lit up with a tentative smile. "Really?" Greg nodded, feeling a strange warmth spread through his chest. "Really?" Jordan threw his arms around Greg's neck, hugging him tightly. Greg hugged him back, closing his eyes as he held the boy close. In that moment, he realized just how attached he'd become to Jordan. The thought both thrilled and terrified him. The next morning, as Greg stepped out to retrieve the newspaper, he noticed an envelope wedged between the screen door and the frame. His heart raced as he carefully picked it up, already knowing what it might contain. He glanced around the quiet street, but everything seemed normal. Back inside, Greg opened the letter with shaking hands. The message was short and chilling. "Stop looking for Leah, or both you and the boy will pay. This is your final warning." Greg's jaw clenched as he read the words. Instead of fear, he felt a surge of determination. He crumpled the paper in his fist, his resolve stronger than ever. "Greg," Jordan's sleepy voice came from the hallway. "Is everything okay?" Greg quickly composed himself, forcing a smile. "Everything's fine, buddy. How about some breakfast?" As Jordan ate his cereal, Greg's mind raced. He knew he couldn't ignore this threat, but he also couldn't let it stop him from finding Leah. He had to protect Jordan at all costs. After dropping Jordan off at school, Greg headed straight to the principal's office. He explained the situation as calmly as he could, leaving out the more frightening details. "I need to make sure Jordan is safe here," Greg said, his voice firm. "Can we set up some extra security measures?" The principal nodded, her face serious. "Of course, Officer Greg. We'll do everything we can to keep Jordan safe." Satisfied with the school's response, Greg drove to the police station. He walked into the chief's office, his mind made up. "Chief, I need to take a leave of absence," Greg said without preamble. The chief looked up, surprised. "What's this about, Greg?" Greg took a deep breath. "It's about Jordan and his mother. The situation is more dangerous than we thought. I need to focus on finding Leah and keeping Jordan safe." The chief leaned back in his chair, studying Greg. "You've really gotten attached to this boy, haven't you?" Greg nodded, not trusting himself to speak. After a moment, the chief sighed. "All right, Greg. Take the time you need, but be careful. Don't do anything stupid." "Thank you, sir," Greg said, relief washing over him. As he left the station, Greg felt a mix of fear and determination. He knew the road ahead would be dangerous, but he was ready to face whatever came his way. For Jordan and Leah, he would do whatever it took. Greg's heart raced as he hung up the phone. He'd just received a tip from an old police contact. Leah had been spotted in a small town just 50 miles away, living under the name Nanita Thompson. This was the break he'd been waiting for. "Jordan," Greg called out, his voice filled with excitement. "Pack a bag, buddy. We might be going on a little trip soon." As Jordan scampered off to his room, Greg began gathering essentials. His mind was whirling with plans and precautions. He knew they had to move fast, but safely. Night fell and Greg tucked Jordan into bed. "Get some rest, kiddo. We've got a big day tomorrow," he said softly, ruffling the boy's hair. Greg settled into his armchair in the living room, his gun within reach. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The house creaked and groaned in the darkness, setting his nerves on edge. Suddenly, a muffled thud from the backyard jolted Greg to attention. His police instincts kicked in as he silently moved towards Jordan's room. Before he could reach it, the sound of breaking glass shattered the quiet night. "Jordan!" Greg yelled, bursting into the boy's room. Jordan sat up in bed, eyes wide with fear. "Under the bed now!" Greg commanded, his voice steady despite the panic rising in his chest. Jordan obeyed instantly, scrambling to safety. Heavy footsteps echoed through the house. Greg positioned himself in front of the bedroom door, gun drawn. His heart pounded in his ears as he waited. The door burst open and a large man lunged at Greg. They grappled fiercely, the gun knocked from Greg's hand in the struggle. Greg's police training kicked in as he fought back with everything he had. "Where's the boy?" a gruff voice demanded. "You're not touching him," Greg growled, landing a solid punch to the man's jaw. More men poured into the room, but Greg was ready. He'd prepared for this, setting up hidden alarms and reinforcing the windows. The house erupted in chaos as sirens blared, disorienting the intruders. Greg used the confusion to his advantage, taking down one attacker after another. His fists flew, fueled by a fierce determination to protect Jordan. Despite being outnumbered, Greg fought like a man possessed. "Dad!" Jordan's terrified cry came from under the bed. The word gave Greg a surge of strength. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore, he was fighting for his son. With a final, mighty effort, Greg managed to subdue the last of the attackers. Panting heavily, he quickly secured them with zip ties he'd stashed around the house. "Jordan, it's okay now," Greg said softly, kneeling beside the bed. "You can come out. You're safe." After the harrowing night of the failed abduction, Greg knew they couldn't stay at his house any longer. With Jordan clinging to his side, Greg reached out to his fellow officers for help. To his surprise, they rallied around him without hesitation. "We've got your back, Greg," Officer Martinez said, clapping him on the shoulder. "We'll keep you both safe." Within hours, Greg and Jordan were settled in a secure safe house on the outskirts of town. As Jordan slept fitfully on a worn couch, Greg paced the small living room, his mind racing with plans to find Leah. Over the next few days, Greg was touched by the outpouring of support from the community. Mrs. Johnson from across the street brought over a homemade casserole. The local grocery store owner, Mr. Patel, dropped off a care package filled with Jordan's favorite snacks. "People care, Greg," Officer Martinez said during a visit. "They see how much you're doing for that boy." Greg felt a lump in his throat. He wasn't used to this kind of kindness. With the help of his fellow officers, Greg finally managed to track down Leah. She was working as a waitress in a small diner 2 towns over, always looking over her shoulder. When Greg approached her, Leah's eyes widened with fear. "Is Jordan okay?" she whispered, her hands shaking. "He's safe," Greg assured her gently. "But Leah, you can't keep running. It's not fair to you or Jordan." Tears welled up in Leah's eyes. "You don't understand. He'll find us. He always does." Greg's heart ached for her. He could see the toll the years of abuse and fear had taken on her once vibrant face. "We can protect you, Leah. Me, the police force, and we're all here to help. You and Jordan deserve a life without fear." Leah hesitated, hope and doubt warring in her eyes. "How can you be sure?" "Because I've seen how strong you are," Greg said softly. "And I promise you, you're not alone in this fight anymore." After a long moment, Leah nodded, a tiny spark of hope flickering in her eyes. "Okay," she whispered. "I'll come back with you." As they drove back to the safe house, Greg glanced at Leah. Her hands were clenched tightly in her lap, her eyes darting nervously at every passing car. Greg's determination to protect this family grew stronger. He knew the road ahead would be tough, but for the first time in years he felt ready to face whatever challenges came their way. As Greg pulled up to the safe house, his heart raced with anticipation. He glanced at Leah in the passenger seat, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and hope. "We're here," he said softly. "Are you ready?" Leah nodded, her hands trembling as she reached for the door handle. Greg quickly got out and walked around to help her, offering a steadying hand. Inside, Officer Martinez was keeping Jordan company. The boy looked up as the door opened, his eyes growing huge as he saw who was with Greg. "Mommy?" Jordan's voice was barely a whisper. Leah's eyes filled with tears. "Jordan, baby," she choked out. In an instant, Jordan was on his feet running across the room. Leah dropped to her knees, arms outstretched. They collided in a fierce embrace, both of them sobbing. "I'm so sorry, baby," Leah cried, holding Jordan tight. "I'm so sorry I left you. I love you so much." Jordan buried his face in his mother's neck, his little body shaking with sobs. "I missed you, Mommy," he whimpered. Greg watched the scene unfold, his own eyes misty. He'd never seen Jordan so emotional, so alive. The boy who had been so quiet and withdrawn was now clinging to his mother like a lifeline. Leah looked up at Greg over Jordan's shoulder, her face streaked with tears. "Thank you," she mouthed, her eyes full of gratitude. Greg nodded, feeling a lump form in his throat. He was happy for them, truly he was, but there was an unexpected ache in his chest. In the weeks he'd cared for Jordan, he'd grown to love the boy more than he'd ever thought possible. As Jordan's sobs quieted, Leah gently pulled back to look at her son's face. She wiped his tears with her thumbs, drinking in the sight of him. "You've gotten so big," she said with a watery smile. Jordan managed a small smile back. "Officer Greg took good care of me," he said. Leah looked up at Greg again, this time speaking aloud. "I can't thank you enough for what you've done," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "You protected my boy when I couldn't. I'll never be able to repay you." Greg swallowed hard, trying to keep his own emotions in check. "You don't have to," he said softly. "Seeing you two together, that's all the thanks I need." Greg, Leah, and Jordan returned to town with a mix of relief and caution. The joy of their reunion was tempered by the lingering threat of Jordan's father and his gang. Greg knew they couldn't let their guard down just yet. Back at the police station, Greg huddled with his fellow officers, planning their next move. "We need to end this once and for all," he said, his voice firm with determination. Jordan and Leah deserve to live without fear. As they worked on setting a trap for the gang, Greg couldn't help but marvel at how much his life had changed in such a short time. Just weeks ago, he had been a solitary figure, known for his strict demeanor and emotional distance. Now he found himself at the center of a family drama, fighting to protect a mother and child who had somehow wormed their way into his heart. In quiet moments between strategy sessions, Greg would watch Leah and Jordan together. The sight of them, reunited and happy despite their ordeal, filled him with a warmth he'd never experienced before. He realized that in trying to save Jordan, he had saved a part of himself too. One evening, as the town prepared for the impending showdown, Greg sat on his porch, lost in thought. The street was quiet, but he could feel the tension in the air. Neighbors who had once gossiped about his decision to take in Jordan now nodded respectfully as they passed by. It seemed the whole town was rallying behind them. Leah came out and sat beside him, her presence a comfort he hadn't known he needed. "You've given us so much," she said softly. "Not just safety, but hope." Greg turned to her, his usually stern face softening. "You and Jordan have given me something too," he admitted. "A sense of purpose I didn't know I was missing." As they sat in companionable silence, Greg reflected on the day he had found Jordan in that alley. He had been going through the motions of his job, never expecting that a scared little boy would change everything. Now he couldn't imagine his life any other way. The next morning, as Greg briefed his team on the final details of their plan, he felt a surge of determination. This wasn't just about upholding the law anymore. It was about protecting the family he had unexpectedly found and the new life he had begun to build. The day of the final confrontation arrived, and the town held its breath. Greg stood at the center of the police operation, his heart racing, but his face calm. He had come so far from the rigid, emotionally distant officer he once was. Now he was fighting for a family he never knew he wanted. As the trap was set, Greg caught sight of Jordan and Leah watching from a safe distance. Their eyes met, and in that moment, he knew he would do whatever it took to keep them safe. The gang arrived, led by Jordan's father. The man's face was twisted with anger and hate, a stark contrast to the love Greg had come to feel for Jordan and Leah. As the confrontation began, tensions ran high. "Give up, it's over," Greg called out, his voice steady despite the fear churning in his gut. Jordan's father sneered. "You think you can play hero? You don't know what you're dealing with?" The standoff was tense, with both sides refusing to back down. Greg's fellow officers stood firm beside him, a united front against the threat that had loomed over Jordan and Leah for so long. As the situation escalated, Greg's training kicked in. He moved with precision, coordinating with his team to outmaneuver the gang. The town watched in awe as the man they once saw as cold and distant became a fierce protector. In a heart-stopping moment, Jordan's father made a desperate lunge towards where Leah and Jordan were hiding. Greg reacted instantly, tackling the man to the ground. They struggled, but Greg's determination gave him strength he didn't know he had. "You won't hurt them ever again," Greg growled, pinning the man down. With the leader subdued, the rest of the gang quickly fell to the coordinated efforts of the police force. As handcuffs clicked into place, a collective sigh of relief swept through the town. Greg stood up, breathing hard, and looked around. The street was filled with townspeople who had come out to witness the confrontation. Their faces showed a mix of shock and admiration. Greg, the man they had once whispered about for his rigid ways, had become an unexpected hero. Leah and Jordan rushed to Greg's side, wrapping him in a tight embrace. Tears streamed down their faces as the reality of their newfound safety sank in. "It's over," Greg said softly, his arms around them both. "You're safe now." As the crowd watched this tender moment, they saw a side of Greg they had never known existed. The town's perception of him had been forever changed, just as Greg himself had been transformed by the love of his newfound family. With the threat of Jordan's father finally behind them, Greg, Leah, and Jordan began to piece together a new life. The once quiet officer's home was now filled with the warmth of family, a concept that still felt new and wonderful to Greg. Leah, her eyes bright with hope for the first time in years, started to heal from her long-held trauma. Greg helped her find a therapist who specialized in domestic abuse survivors. Each week, as Leah returned from her sessions, Greg noticed a positive change in her demeanor. "I never thought I'd feel safe again," Leah confessed one evening, her voice soft but steady. "Thank you, Greg, for everything." Greg, still unused to such open emotions, simply nodded, a small smile on his face. Jordan, free from the shadow of fear that had haunted him for so long, began to flourish. His teachers reported a remarkable change in his behavior and academic performance. The once shy boy was now raising his hand in class, making friends, and even joining the school's art club. "Dad, look!" Jordan exclaimed one day, rushing into the house with a colorful drawing. Greg's heart swelled at the word Dad, a title he was growing to cherish. The community, moved by Greg's transformation and his dedication to Leah and Jordan, rallied around the newfound family in ways Greg never expected. Neighbors who once whispered about the stern officer now brought over home-cooked meals and offered babysitting services. Mrs. Thompson, the elderly lady next door who Greg had barely spoken to before, knocked on their door one Sunday afternoon. "I've got some extra tomatoes from my garden," she said, holding out a basket. "And if you need any help with Jordan, I used to be a teacher. I'd be happy to tutor him." Greg, overwhelmed by the kindness, could only stammer a thank you. Even at the police station, things had changed. His fellow officers, once wary of his rigid demeanor, now looked at him with newfound respect. They organized a fundraiser to help Leah and Jordan get back on their feet, raising more money than Greg could have imagined. As weeks turned into months, Greg watched in awe as Leah and Jordan blossomed. Leah found a job at a local community center, helping other women who had escaped abusive situations. Her strength and resilience inspired everyone around her. Jordan's nightmares became less frequent, replaced by excited chatter about school projects and new friends. His laughter, once so rare, now filled the house regularly. One evening, as Greg sat on the porch watching Jordan play in the yard, Leah joined him. "I never thought we'd have this," she said softly. "A home, safety, a family." Greg looked at her, then at Jordan, feeling a sense of peace he'd never known before. "Neither did I," he admitted, "but I'm grateful for it every day." As the weeks passed, Officer Greg found himself spending more and more time at Leah and Jordan's new home. He'd stop by after his shifts, often with a bag of groceries or a new toy for Jordan. The once stern officer had softened, his smile coming more easily now. One Saturday morning, Greg arrived to find Leah struggling with a leaky faucet in the kitchen. Without hesitation, he rolled up his sleeves and got to work. "You don't have to do this, Greg," Leah said, watching him with grateful eyes. Greg looked up from the sink, a wrench in hand. "I want to," he replied simply. "That's what family does, right?" Leah's eyes welled up with tears, touched by his words. She nodded, unable to speak. While Greg fixed the faucet, Jordan burst into the kitchen, his face lit up with excitement. "Can we play catch, Dad?" he asked, holding up a baseball and glove. Greg's heart swelled at being called Dad. He glanced at Leah, who gave him an encouraging nod. "Sure thing, buddy," he said, ruffling Jordan's hair. "Let me finish up here, and we'll head to the backyard." Later, as Greg and Jordan tossed the ball back and forth, their laughter echoed through the yard. Leah watched from the porch, a warm feeling of contentment washing over her. Jordan's first day of school arrived, and both Leah and Greg were there to see him off. They stood at the bus stop, Greg's hand resting supportively on Leah's shoulder as they watched Jordan climb aboard. "He'll be okay," Greg reassured her, seeing the worry in Leah's eyes. Leah nodded, leaning into Greg's comforting presence. "I know. It's just, he's been through so much. And he's strong just like his mom," Greg said softly. As the weeks went by, Jordan thrived in school. Greg often helped him with his homework, patiently explaining math problems or listening as Jordan read aloud. Leah would watch them from the doorway, her heart full of love and gratitude. One evening, as Greg was leaving after dinner, Jordan hugged him tightly. "Thanks for being here, Dad," he said, his voice muffled against Greg's uniform. Greg hugged him back, his eyes meeting Leah's over Jordan's head. In that moment, he knew that this was where he belonged. This unexpected family had changed his life in ways he never could have imagined, and he was thankful for every moment. The sun shone brightly on the town park as families gathered for the annual community picnic. Colorful blankets dotted the grass, and the air was filled with laughter and the smell of grilled food. Among the crowd, Greg, Leah, and Jordan sat together on a checkered blanket, their faces glowing with happiness. Mayor Dela Cruz approached their spot, a wide smile on his face. "Officer Greg," he said warmly, "we can't thank you enough for what you've done for our town. You're a true hero." Greg's cheeks flushed with embarrassment. He shook his head, looking at Leah and Jordan. "I'm no hero, sir," he said softly. "These two right here, they're the real heroes. They changed my life in ways I never thought possible." Leah reached out and squeezed Greg's hand, her eyes shining with gratitude. Jordan beamed up at Greg, pride written all over his face. As the mayor walked away, Jordan tugged on Greg's sleeve. "Can I go play with my friends?" he asked, pointing to a group of children kicking a soccer ball nearby. Greg nodded, ruffling Jordan's hair. "Of course, buddy, have fun." They watched as Jordan ran off, joining the other kids with ease. It was a far cry from the scared, withdrawn boy Greg had found in that alley months ago. Leah turned to Greg, her voice thick with emotion. "I don't know how to thank you, Greg, for everything you've done for us." Greg shook his head, his eyes never leaving Jordan. "You don't need to thank me, Leah. Having you both in my life, it's more than I ever dreamed of." As they sat there, watching Jordan laugh and play, Greg felt a deep sense of peace wash over him. He thought about how much his life had changed since that fateful night. He'd found a family he never knew he needed, and in the process, he'd helped not just Leah and Jordan, but an entire community heal and grow. The sound of Jordan's laughter carried across the park, and Greg smiled. This was where he belonged. This was home. If you enjoyed the story of Officer Greg, Jordan, and Leah, I handpicked this next story that will touch your heart. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.